What up? What's up? I feel like I missed it the first time. That wasn't on. Let me get some stuff set up. What up, Bammer Rock? Okay. What's up, Delphi? Letting some people in. Okay. Uh-oh. My APC just made a sound. That's not good. Okay, we hope that everything's fine. Everything's probably fine. Like, if I had to guess, everything's fine. The APC is the battery backup that everything is plugged into that failed during the last outage this last stream. Oh, Jesus. Or at least the last Age of Umbra stream. Well, it'll be fine. It'll be fine, I'm sure. Age of Umbra isn't cursed. Don't say that, chat. Why is everyone saying that Age of Umbra is cursed? It's not. How are you feeling? Good. I'm feeling all right. All right. So what are your thoughts? Better than 6? Complicated, man. Complicated. It's tough to say because there was so much this episode. How do I want to say it? I've been thinking about how to talk about this episode like all day. And it's very strange because there were so many things that Matt and the players did this episode that feels like they not should have. And this is the struggle with talking about it. It felt like there was so much that happened this episode that were they going to include it? Like, were they going to do the types of things they did this episode at all? They would have been doing it the whole time. But they obviously weren't. So it's a little tough from that perspective. And that's what that's kind of the core of the title right here. Is this what it was meant to be? But it just wasn't? Why wasn't it? Was this just sort of a not last minute, but was this just sort of a thing that Matt wanted to try? I don't know. Wanted to try, but didn't want it to be like a consistent factor throughout the entire limited series. And I say that about a lot of things this session, not just the collaborative bits. The collaborative bits were certainly very, I think, prominent here in a way that I think was pretty unexpected, at least for me. But there was a lot of it throughout. So those are the basis of my thoughts. I'm curious to know your guys' thoughts before I go too far into specifics. Before I go too into specifics, I'm curious as to what you guys thought. Because I have all of my thoughts here. But I want to get your not unbiased, but slightly less biased thoughts before I go into those things. I was about to match together Cursed and Umbra and Amelia. Yep. Yeah. The collaborative bit took me a bit by surprise, which is interesting because I think if you were to talk to people about like what they knew about Daggerheart, the collaborative bit shouldn't have taken anyone by surprise. But I do agree that it felt a little surprising. A little weird. but not like, when I'm looking at it, I'm not like, oh man, that doesn't fit in Daggerheart. It obviously fits in Daggerheart. So what's going on here, right? It's very strange. I have some ideas. I have some thoughts as to why it felt maybe a little bit off, but not in a bad way. I have some thoughts, but I want to know your guys' first. I have a D&D question. Okay. While people roll in their thoughts, I know there's obviously a delay on stream. I'll answer this question while those thoughts roll in. I'm making a warlock and am having problems making a Fey patron. Do I make one up or are they in the book somewhere? I mean, you may be asking the wrong guy about this. I have always been a homebrew Harry, you might say. Ghost of Saltmarsh, the campaign that I'm running right now, is the first campaign I've ever run inside of a pre-established setting. Before then, I have always done homebrew settings. So, I'm not the best one to ask about that. That said, I'm sure that they are somewhere. It would probably be easier to look up something like Forgotten Realms, Fey divinities, or Fey court, or like the Seelie or the Unseelie court. Those are the Unseelie and the Seelie are kind of the organizations, I guess, the factions of Archfey. I believe within the Forgotten Realms, maybe also Greyhawk. I don't really know. I've always just made them up from scratch. Any sort of patrons, any sort of divinities, I go from scratch. Or, actually, that's not exactly true. I have also run in the Elder Scrolls. I've run in Nirn. So, I have used, like, Nirn divinities before. The Daedra and the Aedra. But that would also not be of extreme help here. All right, but let's see what people thought of the episode. I loved the collaborative parts. Funny that when you give them the options to create something, they end up making it worse than the GM would. I have some thoughts about that. Yup. I agree. I am not less biased. The collaborative bits are the second biggest reason I like Daggerheart part. I like Daggerheart and the part that's hardest to explain. So I'm annoyed that they didn't do it earlier and more consistently. Yeah, I think that's a really fair reaction. And one of the things that made this episode confusing is not the right word, but just the only word that keeps coming to mind is odd, just strange. Because I had just kind of gotten used to the idea that they just weren't going to do that level of extreme collaboration. And then they throw it in like not just throw it in, but like it's a pretty, substantial part of this episode, I would say. It's not out of nowhere, obviously, but it's just it's strange that this is like the first time we're getting such a big moment of it. It's like the first instance of in-game collaboration story building as opposed to session 0. I might be wrong. It's one of the first. I vaguely remember something in the earlier episodes. I think like sometimes something around the monastery, I want to say. There was like one question that Matt asked, like something to do with like I think the tapestries or something like that in the monastery, but nothing really came of it. And I might even be fabricating that in my memory, but there's nothing that stood out to me in terms of collaborative world building outside of session 0 like this segment. This segment was very substantial. And I think it's fair that it's like the first thing that people bring up. Yeah. I wonder if he felt it was easier to do collaborative parts when there were less players, as previously it would have been hard to give everyone a chance to take part. I mean, Bad Wolf, I might agree if they had that many more players, but they gained 2 for 1 session, or no, 2 sessions, right? 5 and 6. Or I guess 3. Okay. They had 7 total for 3 sessions and 5 total for 3 sessions. And now they have 4. So I mean, possibly, but I don't know that the difference of like 5 players to 4 players would have made that much of a difference. Maybe it did. But like I can maybe see that for like the difference between, episodes 4 through 6 compared to 7, right? That was like a 3-player drop, definitely substantial. But definitely no, I don't think that there's a huge difference between 4 players and 5 players, which, they had for the first 3. But maybe you could say they didn't want to do as much collaborative stuff in the first couple episodes. That's possible. I don't know. I'm not sure. I would find it odd if that was the answer, but I find the entire thing odd. So I definitely can't discount it. Yeah. I wonder if this lack of collaborative story building earlier was due to time plot constraints. I mean, maybe. If it was, I mean, if it truly was like something that they would have wanted to do, but they felt constrained by the time, I find it odd at this point that the monastery was even included. Like the first 2 episodes feel a little bit like killing time at this point compared to how relevant they've been. Like it was 2 episodes for them to activate the inciting incident that actually kickstarted episode 3. In a way, it kind of feels like 2 wasted episodes. Like the Velk fight was super cool. The Gate Guardian was cool. But it sort of feels like you could have just had a smoke monster attack in the first session and have that be, or just have Velk come back from the monastery and be the, Aaron equivalent, and have that be like the end of the first session, kick off session 2 with it. I mean, it feels like if there were time constraints, there are easy ways to cut time towards the beginning. But that's not to say that it's not true. That might have just been what happened. It would feel more natural if it was done consistently, or if something changed in fiction to explain why the PCs had some control. Totally agree. I'm left confused as to why he chooses to be collaborative or not. And if I didn't have my own style, I'd be wondering what the rule of thumb Matt was trying to convey was. I completely agree. I think that that's one of the things that really struck me about this episode, is that there were so many parts of this episode that I liked, but they were in almost direct contrast with very similar things from the previous 6 episodes that were handled totally differently. I had the same kind of thought in regards to some of the environmental stuff. I don't know why I put the stress in a weird place. The environmental stuff in episode 6, where it's like, okay, we're handling it like this? Why are we handling it like this instead of the way we've handled it the past 5 episodes? It feels like Matt is like switching up style as we've gone through, but for no clear in-fiction purpose or rationale. It doesn't feel like the switch in style is meant to convey anything. Like, at most generous, I would say that, maybe he wants to display several different, like, tones that could be evoked with the same set of mechanics. Like several different ways that you could GM similar events. Sorry, there's like a weird stain on my shirt. It's because my hair is wet. I took a shower. But that's like at most generous. At least generous, it kind of just feels like he doesn't have a clear idea of like how the mechanics are meant to be used, or like, I guess not even meant to be used, but how he wants to use them, which frankly seems more likely to me. especially given how big, at least to my understanding, the difference was between the last beta and actual release. And it does seem pretty clear to me that they were filming this, during that transition period between that final beta and that release. It seems like they hadn't had the final release rules nailed down for very long, because I still see them slipping into what seems like beta rules. Like when they talked about the movement in episode 6, they refer to kind of a cheese, a type of movement that was patched out in in full release. Like the thing that they were talking about wasn't possible in full release. And so again, to me, it seems relatively clear that even though they had the full release rules, they hadn't been using them for very long, or they weren't very used to them. And so that sort of leads me towards this more sort of overall view that they just weren't very used to the rules that they were using, and, what sort of tones they wanted to evoke with them. And we'll go to my notes a little bit. Actually, I'll read more chat first. We'll finish this general discussion, then I'll go into my notes. But let's see. I guess it's easier to let the players have more input in the late game so that it doesn't spiral. But as pointed out, collaboration is part of DH. I mean, I think you're right, but I also think that there's a way. I mean, I think clearly Matt did it this session in a way that would protect against spiraling. Like he just asked, well, you kind of did it in both ways, right? So the basement in general, like what was there, what the people are saying to each other, when they talk to the dead, that all could spiral. Absolutely. But there's also a much more constrained version of that collaboration that Matt did, where he asked Misty / Ashley what sort of danger or bane they might face in the later exploration sequence. That's pretty contained. Like that is just asking one player, one thing that will have a very contained effect. It'll only affect really that exploration sequence, or even on a larger scale, it might affect, future exploration sequences in that specific location. So if the, spiraling is the worry, Matt certainly displayed that he's well aware of ways to constrain that. I mean, I think you're still right. I think it is easier to constrain it later, but there's certainly ways around it, How dare you, Babe? I know. They made the system, run their own production schedule, own the company. I find the idea that they couldn't make the timing work hard to believe, personally. I agree, but also I know the feeling of, I don't want to say a tight production schedule, but I know the feeling of like just wanting to get something out. There also might be, promotional relations that they had set. I could also just see something having run unexpectedly behind schedule. So possibly they were very confident that, like, say the printer that was supposed to print all of the books, right, was in China, and maybe China gets hit with a whole buttload of tariffs, and they have to very quickly change where they are getting all of the printings done. And so that puts a, maybe a more constrained thing, but it's after they've already announced the date. Just one hypothetical. I don't know that would have affected their, knowledge of the rules, but that sort of thing could affect the production timeline, maybe very close to after they'd already announced the release date. So I'm not saying it's definitely, what happened, but I think it could have had an effect. We don't know. Sam compliments Matt on the collab piece. Matt, it's one of the cool things that Daggerheart and other modern RPGs do that I have to remind myself as that invitational point. Which that is, again, it's odd to an extent, because that's such a reasonable thing to say from Matt there. That's so reasonable and understandable of like, yeah, it's, something I'm not very used to doing. So I have to kind of remind myself to do it occasionally. But it's just, it's very strange to me that it seems like one of the, I don't want to say the core selling points, but one of the really big things, at least that people talk about in relation to Daggerheart, is this collaborative nature. I think they talk about, fear and hope, no initiative, and the collaborative bits. I think those are the big hitters. Maybe now campaign frames, now that Age of Umbra has like really showed these off. And so it strikes me as strange at the least that it would take 7 episodes, the majority of the runtime, before you would remember this, to do this. Even this thing that is, admittedly hard to remember, hard to get used to. That seems like a perfectly valid thing to say when you're not doing it the first 3 episodes, right? It's like, gotta remember it. And then it happens in the 4th, maybe. That's even me stretching it a little bit. But 6 is a little wild to me. And it's certainly possible, but it speaks to, I don't know, almost a lack of really trying to like show off Daggerheart, if that makes sense. It almost like, and one of the things that this episode reinforced for me, and at least in my opinion of Age of Umbra, is that this feels a lot like a home game, not really an actual play that is the first party representation of a system that they designed from scratch. And in a way, I can't necessarily blame them for that, but it's so outside of what my expectations were for Age of Umbra. Like it just made sense to me that this was going to be like, they had all of the, I don't want to say the cards stacked in their favor, but it seems that Age of Umbra was this really golden opportunity to really show off Daggerheart. And at a lot of turns, it just seems that Matt wasn't really concerned with that, or that production wasn't really concerned with that. We talked a little bit about the editing, but I think there's arguments on both sides for how that can or should be. But I mean, I look at like the plot, and it's like the plot here makes total sense to me for a home game, like a beer and chips type of home game, where like people are just like getting together and they just like want to roll some dice and do some RP and, combats and whatever. And it kind of doesn't matter what the overall plot is, or not that it doesn't matter, but the overall plot is more of an excuse to just sit down and play. Hey, perfectly valid way, totally valid way to play a home game. I've done that myself. I encourage it. D&D is a fun hobby. You don't have to put a ton of effort into the plot. You can just kind of have these more sort of episodic or one-off sessions with a loose thread to tie it all together. But that was just not at all what I expected from Critical Role producing an actual play in the system that they personally in-house designed. it was just totally outside of my expectations that it would feel that way. Because everything about Age of Umbra, I'm like, yeah, if this is a home game, yeah, go nuts. Absolutely. Rock Shaka, dude. But it's nothing like Vox Machina. And I doubt that campaign 2 and 3 have really changed that much in this direction that it would be recognizable to C3. Maybe it shit does. I don't know. Maybe C3 is highly episodic. That just seems unlikely to me. So I don't know. It's all just, like I said, it's very strange. The diff between final release and beta was odd, small changes on paper, but to core systems, so it has a bigger impact than it would seem by word count. That has been my impression of it, yeah. Is that, and so from that perspective, say if they had a tight filming schedule for whatever reason, which, I agree with your earlier comment, Daniel, I know I sort of gave an alternate argument, but I do think that overall, they had control over all the levers. They could have delayed things. I understand the desire to not delay things, but they could have. They had full control over that. So if they needed more time to experiment with the rules and to get used to the rules, they could have taken it. But it definitely feels like there's a bit of a disconnect there. It feels like in certain cases, they are more used to sort of the old way of doing things. So I don't know. Continuation. What up, Tiny Monkey? Playing a lot of older games, it's very much on the GM to push that forward, which is also great, and you can play Daggerheart that way. But as we've gone on to this, I've also wanted to ramp in slowly some of those mechanics and some of those facets that expand the experience and make it more of a collaboration, and also do it to a point in which you are comfortable. Man. That's definitely interesting. Episode 7 feels so late. I just feel like I'm not going to get any amount of time to really, actually experience those. And it's also, I think maybe this is a little bit telling to me, this quote, of kind of what Matt's focused on, which it seems to be the players. And again, I can't fault him for that. I'll hold my hands up. I can't fault a DM for being more focused on his players and the enjoyment of his players compared to the audience. But again, it's just, to me, totally unexpected from Critical Role when they're making an actual play. I sort of assumed, and maybe naively, that they had a, maybe a quote-unquote home game. Like, Wizards of the Coast talks about this all the time, that Wizards of the Coast has several campaigns with their employees that they're always running. Just at work with employees. And I just assumed, frankly, that Darrington had a similar thing with Daggerheart, so that all of the players were getting those experiences. And we talked about the idea of ramping in a little bit in the first couple of sessions when there hadn't been an environmental stat block, right? The environmental stat block absolutely felt like a slow ramp in. The collaborative world building did not. This feels like an afterthought, not a slow ramp in. And so it's very interesting, and maybe I'm being sort of skewed by where I am in Vox Machina, but I've just not seen Matt prioritize the players over the audience, nearly as much. That's one of my big problems with the Kraken episode, is that it felt like so much of it was for the audience. So again, I can't blame him if that is the case, and this is kind of what this quote implies to me, is do it to a point which you are comfortable. To me, that feels like a production discussion. That feels similar to me of me and Paige are planning a video game playthrough, like a dual kind of race through a puzzle game. and we're doing a bunch of tests. Like we're testing with different games, we're testing with different like production methods, because she gets motion sickness from video games, and so we're testing different production formats to figure out exactly where she's comfortable, how long can she film, do we need to take special preparations in the actual space? Like, I say special preparations, things like bringing a fan in, and like making sure that fan's there and on full blast, and whatever, timing the either filming or streaming for like after a meal or right before a meal, or what have you. So we're doing all of that ahead of time, which is kind of what I assumed that, again, what I assumed Critical Role would do. So the idea of like, I want to bring it into a point at which you're comfortable, I kind of assumed that they all would already know that. And so that only means to me that either they don't know that, which I find unlikely, or that the players aren't too comfortable with it, but are kind of comfortable with it. The only other thing that could imply to me, I guess, is that the characters are that the players are only comfortable with the collaborative stuff to the point where Matt can show it like once near the end to just like show that it exists, but no more than that. Right? Like that. But that also seems unlikely to me, given the cast. That they are that uncomfortable with the collaborative nature. Like, everything that I've seen from the CR cast would not lead me to believe that. So I don't know. That also seems odd. That seems like an odd like train of thought. So it's so, I don't know. I love the way player decisions can impact things oddly. A good example from playtests. I've seen players say that trees had 0 branches near the ground. Now the ambushers have to change tactics. I agree that that's super cool. And I have no, I think the surprising thing to me is how late it was. It doesn't feel like a ramp up. It doesn't feel consistent. It just feels out of nowhere. No matter how you're going to do the player interaction, I'm just surprised at how it was done here, and purely the timing aspect of it, because it feels like something that Matt wouldn't have needed to like suss out. Was just watching you slowly go through what I'd call CR's worst post-Orion experience. It's crazy, man. The last few things I've seen of Critical Roles have all been so odd. Because I'm just in Critical Eyes, I'm just getting through the Kraken episode 88, which was tough. Sometimes you only learn the rules by playing, so taking extra time to try and learn the rule changes might not be that easy. It might not be. I mean, but I guess I'm just. Honestly, that's the thing that I'm not so surprised that is happening. I'm not that surprised that they're still getting mixed up on beta rulings, especially, again, given my assumption of how much they've been playing. That assumption could be wrong, but I'm assuming that they've been playing quite a bit throughout all the betas. So them getting confused on like beta versus full release rulings, that makes sense to me. But I don't know. Rampant slowly isn't what this felt like, regardless of intention. Yeah, it felt like a binary switch. It went from like all Matt driven to suddenly players making 20 decisions in a row. Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah, the rampant slowly, I was not feeling. Yeah, I do think they prioritize their own enjoyment. It really is their home game to them. Obviously, it's not a normal home game, but I think that's how they think of it before entertainment. That is certainly what this feels like. But it's so I don't know. It was very I felt myself very not unlikely, but even compared to Vox Machina, compared to like the story construction in Vox Machina, this feels very different to me. But maybe they trend more in this direction in C2 and 3. It's possible. I think I wonder if all the internet comments in the past is why Matt is now focusing on his players and not audience. It's not even saying like focusing on his players rather than audience. That's not even exactly what I mean. To me, this feels almost like there was not even necessarily a focus on the players, but a total ignoring of the audience. Like, I'm trying not to be too like hyperbolic or rude in this. I don't want it. I feel like, saying they were ignoring the audience sounds very like intentional and malicious. But it feels like there are simple things that could have been done. Like, even, again, just like predetermining how much collaboration the players are down with. Like, that seems like an obvious session 0 question. In fact, I wonder, that might even be one of the session 0 questions in the book, now that I think about it. And so it feels like Matt wouldn't have needed to like suss it out. And so if Matt didn't need to suss it out, and he knew how much collaboration they were comfortable with ahead of time, you can still focus on the players and like keeping that level of collaboration in a range that they're comfortable with, but make it consistent. Which I don't, feel like this was at all. I'm looking up those session 0 questions because I'm actually curious. I know that there are some like prep questions, but I don't remember what they are. Is it in safety tools? It's probably in safety tools, if I had to guess. Yeah, session 0. All right, laying the groundwork. Cats. Concept, aim, tone, subject. Aim, tone, subject. Lines and veils. X card. Asking questions. Oh, maybe not. Maybe they don't have any of that. Ahead of session, you want to prepare materials, session overview, cats break, world building break, character creation break, introductory scene, wrap up and feedback. Maybe not. Okay, never mind. They might not. I thought that they addressed it somewhere in here, but I'm not seeing it, so maybe not. Anyways. Let's see. Oh, and I got rid of chat. I should read that. I think Darrington does have consistent games, but I don't think they involve main cast besides Matt for whatever reason. Oh, interesting. We hear a little bit about some of the other cast having some. Gotcha. Interesting. Collaborative storytelling specifically, I think Matt himself may not be 100% comfortable with it. Maybe. I mean, that's the only thing I can really come to there. Yeah. I think they're in an odd spot for collaboration. The players are used to Exandria, a huge lore bomb in Matt's baby. He lets them make things like Whitestone, but Matt condons them off? I don't know that word. It just looks like condoms them off, which, I mean, still makes sense to me, honestly. Now they're in a world that may only be this one shot and are being asked to invent things in the moment. No time to think. It's quite different. Yeah. I mean, it's certainly quite different. And I mean, honestly, to a large degree, I thought we just wouldn't see it. So I begin to question why it's in there at all, if at this point. And the only thing I can think is that Matt forced himself to put it in there so that, the audience would see it. Like maybe that was just a choice made primarily for the audience. If it was, a little ham-fisted, but I guess I get it. Yeah. I think they're basically doing all their DH playing on camera, which is something like between 5 and 10 sessions, I want to say, since beta, lower end of that. Yeah, I suppose. Which, like I said, that's something that I can absolutely see my expectation being off on that. But even that, I mean, I guess in that vein, if it's not in the session 0 discussion that's kind of encouraged here, which from me looking at it, it doesn't seem like it is. I'm taking that a little bit to heart as something I probably want to do, is include a discussion of session 0 stuff. Oh, I'm also, damn it. I thought I was being, what the hell is going on with my scene? I don't even know. I'm sorry. Am I even on the, oh my gosh, everything's going wrong. I'm just going to turn off studio mode because it like got rid of my camera. And I don't want it to do that. I just wanted to give you guys a nice gray background. There we go. Anyways, this is definitely reinforcing to me that the degree and the type of collaboration that will be done during the campaign definitely seems like a session 0 discussion. Because if Matt is like, I guess like vibe testing how much the players are going to want to collaborate, number one, I haven't really noticed him doing it at all. Like, I haven't really noticed him like testing it or like trying to figure it out. Maybe he has, and I just haven't noticed. But it definitely seems like something to establish in the session 0. And they, even if we just take their behavior and like their willingness to create things during session 0, even just with what we saw, I would have assumed that they would be really into it. So I definitely didn't get any sort of indication that they seem super hesitant about it. So maybe it's just Matt, which I could see. I mean, I'm certainly hesitant about it. Like, if this was my game, I could certainly see this sort of thing happening, where I realize 7 sessions in, I haven't done a single collaborative sequence, and then I go a little bit too overboard on it. Like, you know, Matt's human. I get it. But I will definitely say that it made it feel strange and a little bit out of left field, even though I didn't, totally hate it. Corden. Oh, Corden with an R. That makes sense. Oh my gosh. Why is this? Everything just broke. And I don't know why. But now it's back. There we go. Yeah. Okay, we'll jump into some of my notes at least. I have an entire section on collaborative world building and exploration. And I said exactly what I think a lot of you were feeling. This feels like one of the first times, or at least the most in your face, that Matt has asked the players to describe an environment like this. And I was looking at it a little bit more, not necessarily in the context of on how odd it felt throughout the series, but I was thinking about the specific implementation of it for my own games, possibly. And I said, on one hand, it tips your hand a bit as the GM. It shows that nothing's there. Especially like, and I think it's partially because this was so unprecedented. And I don't mean that in like the hyperbolic way, just literally, it doesn't have a lot of precedent in Age of Umbra currently. Because this was so unprecedented, it made it feel like an improv tactic rather than a tonal thing. And so I think that it really highlighted that there was nothing there, unfortunately. I think that effect would diminish as time goes on and as you get kind of a rhythm of when you do it. Your players start to, kind of be able to get used to a pattern of it. I think that will be less of a downside. But on the other hand, and this is more positive in my mind at least, it seems like a really solid way to cover for interest gaps that you have as a GM. Like, I talked after session 0 about the fact that, like, I don't think Matt's as into making unique locations. So I thought it was interesting that in the, like, public session 0 that we all got to see, Matt had them all make locations, but not factions or people. And it seems like that can be not just a session 0 thing, but a collaborative world building thing in general. Like, for me, who's not as into characters, it's like, oh, you go into a bar, describe the bartender, right? Like, what does the bartender look like? How do they act? Like, that is something I can find myself very likely to do, as opposed to what's in the basement. I'll have a very keen idea of what's in the basement. Or even I could see myself, if I transplant myself into Age of Umbra, I could see myself having said, you hear some people that you know are from the, or that you get the sense are from the Queen's retinue. What are they talking about? What are they doing here? I could absolutely see myself doing something like that while having the actual house and cellar and all of that sort of stuff much more built out. Because that's, again, a sort of interest gap for me as a GM. I'm not as interested in those sort of things. And Daniel's saying he has strategies to make there be something there. It just takes practice, which I think is fair. Like, you know, I've talked a lot about, like, floating content, you know, more modular content. And it seems like those would be good spots. Like, spots where you could normally, like, slot in a modular thing that you've made previously. That's probably a good spot to ask for some collaborative world building, or, you know, sort of engage within that. And then if they don't have enough, or they're not really feeling it at the moment, you still have that thing that you would normally slot in if this was, you know, say D&D. So it makes total sense to me from that perspective. And I think it's a cool part of Daggerheart, truly. But, you know, and you can see me say it here, I'm surprised he hasn't been doing this more. Especially with Taliesin or Ashley in the Screaming Forest. Like, the Screaming Forest was Taliesin and Ashley's creation. I've even seen him. It seems like mostly Taliesin, but who knows how much, you know, Ashley was or wasn't involved off screen. I've seen him do this with Taliesin in Whitestone, where, like, they talk in real time at the table about, like, things that are in Whitestone. So I, like, in terms of running locations that people have helped create, players have helped create, I've watched him do it in D&D, a system that doesn't even encourage it. You know, it's so it's very standout to me that it just hasn't happened yet in Daggerheart. And it does sort of lead me to the belief that this might just be a comfort thing, that those collaborative world building moments are just harder. And so Matt is sort of falling back on his natural style that he's been doing for, you know, 6-7 years, professionally, weekly. It makes total sense to me that he might be just falling back on those things. And, you know, forgetting about maybe some of the more, or not forgetting about, but maybe, you know, hesitating away from some of the more non-D&D aspects of Daggerheart. And I mean, this even sort of goes into the whole problem that I had with session 6 of the, you know, off-turn GM moves, where there's, you know, no trigger. There's just, you know, a trigger whenever you want. That's a very D&D thing. And so when Matt sees a problem, you know, like them talking about the cheesy movement at the end of episode 6, or them escaping from this boss fight at the beginning of episode 6, he falls back on things that he could do in D&D. Like that, to be clear, that all makes total sense to me. And I don't fault Matt for it at all. It's very natural. It just is very throwing to me when I see it. And it does. I'm trying to think of a way to phrase this that doesn't sound mean, but just purely like constructively critical. Because the time is sort of past now, but it sort of feels like it might have behooved them to run an 8-episode, an 8-session home game altogether before doing Age of Umbra. Because they all know it well enough and they're in this big produced studio. Like, it doesn't feel like a test, right? It doesn't feel like, oh, we're, audience surrogate. We're right alongside you. We're normal people in terms of our affiliation and knowledge and relationship with Daggerheart. We're the average audience member. And we're just figuring this out like you guys are, right? It doesn't feel like that because they have the cool range stick and they have all of these set pieces and they have the kicker that scares everyone every time it goes off. And they have, all of this stuff, and they obviously have this huge affiliation. Clearly, they're the creators. But actually watching the game, it does kind of give the sense that they are very new to it. Yeah. Which I guess in terms of constructive feedback, if anyone at Critical Role was listening, I doubt it, but if they were, I don't know, maybe take some time before the next one, if you're doing something else in Daggerheart, maybe run like an offline home game. Because Age of Umbra in general has had so many cool things, so many cool moments, so much cool shit, a lot of cool lore. Honestly, Age of Umbra has gotten me so interested in Daggerheart. But it also consistently feels like a example that is less than it could be. Even if you were purely focusing on player experience, you weren't worried about like portraying things to the audience. It just it pretty consistently feels like things are just kind of getting thrown in, and there's not a lot of consistency or patterns. Like it's making it a little bit hard for me to tell what Daggerheart is even intended to look like. Like, I see some really cool things that I want to use and I want to experience. I've even seen some things that I want to start implementing in my D&D games. But it's only bits and pieces. And that's even to say to my audience for home games and for home DMing, maybe run a limited series before starting a campaign in Daggerheart. Maybe run. Yeah, I'm normally thinking more in terms of one-shots and campaigns. Those are kind of the two routes my mind goes in. But I do think for Daggerheart, a lot of the stuff is pattern setting as a DM. It is that collaborative world building and seeing how it ripples out. I think you need multiple episodes to experience a lot of the facets of Daggerheart, or at least it seems like it. But I may not jump into a whole campaign first if I was you, because I think your first limited series is probably going to feel a lot like Age of Umbra, where it's going to be, you as a GM getting used to things, falling back on your D&D experience, not quite diving headfirst into all of Daggerheart, needing to figure out with your players, test things out, see how much you like the collaborative nature, see how you want the GM to spend their fear. If that feels too expensive or if that feels like you're using it too often. I also had a bit here with the tone of fear that I think really wraps into this of at 1:59:15, this was when they were sort of making their way through the city, and there were a few checks, it seems, in a row where they would have failed the check, but a player used a resource, which they were totally, able to use according to the rules, and turned the failure into a success. And then almost right afterwards, Matt uses a fear. And it felt weird to me. I was like, oh, what? Like they use a resource so it succeeds, so then you punish them with a fear? That feels bad. But obviously that's not what's going on. He's not punishing them. And so I said it felt a bit off to me. It felt like he was spending fear because he's mad that they were succeeding. And I don't think that's what was going on, to be super clear. I don't think that's what was going on at all. But it made me consider that not only the frequency or the magnitude of fear spending, that's not the only thing that matters. The timing of it really has an impact on the tone of like the GM versus player dynamic and how adversarial that might feel. And I said, tentatively, I'm not a fan so far. This is a very new thought for me, very new thought. I'm not a fear of this sort of reaction spending after a success if the player just spent a resource to make it succeed. Because it's very similar to when Matt spent a fear in episode 6 to negate advantage when they were trying to catch the crawling hand. He spent a fear to negate the advantage. But that was before either side knew if the roll succeeded. And I said, I made kind of a ham-fisted analogy here, but it's the difference between the GM and the players both committing forces or energy to the same fight versus the GM attacking the players after the players successfully attack them. It's very close, but it's like it's a contest versus retaliation. And I'm not even saying don't do retaliation. I say it right here. It's just not for me. That sort of tone, that retaliatory tone, just really like gave me the ick. I did not like it. But some tables might like that more. And so all that is to say, I think for your own home tables, a limited series where you have time to experience the mechanics before starting a campaign, I think will be very valuable to suss out a lot of these things. I think it'll be incredibly valuable. Yeah. You got it. That's the core of my entire strategy. Oh, the modularity stuff? Yeah. Build content with a gap. I have this vague plot that needs a sympathetic figure. If the players give me one, use theirs. You seem genius. If they never give you one that works, you can go back to inventing your own. Absolutely. Like, I think, and that's what I'm saying, is like so much of Age of Umbra has shown me so many things that I think are really cool, but none of them feel like they're used in a consistent manner, Jamming loose rules games are harder for most people. I'm one of the biggest proponents of DH, and I'll echo the recommendation to start slow. Fair enough. And I mean, there's even more that I have here in terms of location mechanics and white room explorations. Like, I think there's a lot that this got me thinking about in terms of Daggerheart versus D&D and maybe the strengths or weaknesses. But this really feels like a sort of test experience. And after this, I think their next Daggerheart project will be much more cohesive. But it's just so outside of my expectations for the series. Which I'm trying to temper. I'm trying to kind of dissect what was I expecting, and am I just, feeling some sort of way because my expectations were broken, or is this actually something I don't like? And I think there's a bit of both going on, where I had, these, I think, very, I had a generally more polished expectation of like what would be going on here. Not in terms of the story necessarily. Like Critical Role is always a bit unpolished, a bit raw. People talk about it just being sticking a camera in front of a home game. I get all that. But in terms of the actual play, I thought it would be a little bit more polished and consistent. For everything that I've said about like Matt's style as opposed to mine during Vox Machina, he's pretty damn consistent with his style. He's rarely, well, he's consistent in his inconsistency. I think he very much ties mechanics and how he uses them to like tonal beats. I think that's the really consistent thing that I see from Matt. And I'm not seeing that at all in Age of Umbra. Which just gives me the sense that he's not overly comfortable with the rules. And he doesn't know how to bend them to the tonal beats like he would in D&D. Which is... It's at the very least, it's interesting. Run ads? Yeah, we'll run ads in a minute. And then we'll go into kind of the rest of my notes here. I wonder if Matt was comfortable with the beta and it was how he wanted the system, but since it's not Matt's system, but CR's, and and was being released, he's not truly happy with it and the ways to use it. I mean, that it's, obviously speculation. Could be. It could be, not even that distinct. It might have just been that he was more comfortable with the beta. Like, it made more intuitive sense to him. But he might have totally supported all the changes. I don't want to try to imagine if he's happy with them or not. But I do think there's some apparent discomfort. And that might just be that even though he likes these new rules and maybe agrees with the changes or disagrees, who knows? It might just be that they are a less intuitive way to GM for him. It's just a overall less comfortable way. What's up? Hello, we're back. Okay. So I have some quick hitters that were mostly just about individual points within the session. And then I have one kind of big thing to end on. So I'll save that for the end, cuz that'll be a conversation that I think will go for a while. Or maybe not. Maybe I will just be talking for a while. So first little thing, the stealth escape. When they were going through can't remember what it was called. Maybe the Ashcall Quarter. The environment with all of the queens. At 1/20/12. He used a progress clock in line with a consequence clock. I don't know if people remember. This is the almost exact thing that I talked about in the dynamic countdown timers section from episode 5, where I talked about all of the various reasons that I would use a dynamic countdown timer as opposed to something else. And one of the specific things that I pointed out, like one of these specific alternatives to the dynamic progress clock, was... Nope, not right there. Where was it? Oh, does it matter? Do I need credit for this? Maybe, maybe not. I think it's right here. Oh, yeah. Is Matt doing that? So far, I feel like they're just lost in a dangerous area. I would be representing this with 2 dice. One would count down every time they did an action. When it reaches 0, the challenge ends and they get a bad consequence. The other die would be a normal obstacle clock, which they need to get to 0 to escape. That is exactly what we saw here. And again, it's this strange aspect of, to me, the tones. Oh, wait, no, this is not the segment. There it is. The tones of what was going on here with this stealth escape and the way that that would be mechanically translated were almost identical to the forest. Like, I saw no reason that the forest, the screaming forest that is, should have been dynamic. It seems in retrospect that with the screaming forest, Mother was chasing them, I think, but that was not clear, at least to me, during that. So it sort of was a chase sequence, which does kind of make sense for a dynamic countdown clock, but they were also lost. So they had to like figure out a way out. It was just strange to me. And again, it goes back to, a lot of this session went back to like, oh, is Matt just like trying shit out? I think I might have said it at some point during this. If I didn't, it might have been up in some of these notes. But at one point, I just wrote, I think Matt might just be trying out mechanics and like seeing what feels right to him. And again, I can't blame him for that. It just feels very weird in an actual play like this from them. And I think it's also partially because, at least in my head, again, you know, this might have been incorrect or naive, but it feels like they should have more expertise, right? It's like people talk like about watching Critical Role to learn D&D. And I think that is one of the reasons that Matt has developed this like legendary status, is like, you know, the rules lawyer and like knowing all the rules of D&D. And so I do kind of have this like proficiency myth built up in my head. And it, I think, was even stronger when they designed the system. But that might not be fair. You know, that might be me inappropriately assigning that to him. But anyways, the stealth escape, progress and consequence, exactly the sort of thing I would have used. I think it also works fantastically for these sorts of stealth sequences. And one of the great things about using these simultaneous clocks that are like tracking different things for a stealth sequence is that if the consequence timer ticks all the way down, you can convert the progress clock into a dynamic clock, where you now represent like they've done they've accomplished this stuff during the stealth sequence, so they get to keep their progress. But now they have people that are going to actively contest their progress. Whereas before, they were doing things uncontested because they were stealthed. Now they're being contested, so it turns into a dynamic clock, which I think would have been very neat, but they didn't get caught, which is, also a perfectly great way for this to resolve. And I really loved this example of clocks and how to use them compared to the example that we got in the Screaming Forest. This one made way more sense to me, and I think it was overall, at least in my opinion, a better example of it. And the only thing that I kind of wish for the entire exploration of the Queen's area is that I had a better sense of how far through it they were. It just kind of felt like they were just moving through it. They're at the end. I had no real concept of how close they were to the end for most of the time that they were in it. So I wish there had been something there for that, or even if Matt had just maybe narrated a little bit more actively about how close they were getting to the next stage. That would have been nice. Also, this is a total side little bit, but if there was ever a time for a Slay the Spire-esque exploration minigame, this fictional situation seemed perfect for it. Not saying that Matt needed to do that, but recommending it to at-home people. This was a fictional situation where there's one entrance, one exit, and then a big corridor with lots of different stuff that they don't know about, and it's all going to be surprising. They could explore through in a Slay the Spire-esque little exploration minigame. And if you don't know what I mean by Slay the Spire map, this is what the Slay the Spire sort of meta map looks like. So it has all of these little nodes that give you vague ideas of what are there. Like that little person is you can't even see that. Can I expand this to a new window? Open image in new tab. There we go. That's much better for you guys to see. So you can see that this little symbol means that it is an enemy, but you don't know what enemy it's going to be. Or that this is treasure, but you don't know what treasure it's going to be. And you could do your own legend for anything under the sun in this case. But I think that would have been a really fun way to progress through that Queen's environment. Next thing I wanted to point out, 146.59, Devil Deal. I don't think we've gotten one of these yet. Or maybe we have. I kind of remember mentioning it at one point, but I think that was during Critical Eyes. I don't think that was during this. And I don't know where the rule for it is. I looked for it, but I didn't look very hard for it. For some reason, when you said Slay the Spire, my mind went to Darkest Dungeon, and I was a bit confused. No, not Darkest Dungeon. No. Darkest Dungeon, there's probably a way you could port that over, especially for Age of Umbra. But no, that is not what I was talking about. And I don't think that's as, definitely not as, intuitive. Let's see. Where has my little devil deal gone? Additional rules. Simultaneous. Player best practices. Nope. Is it in running an adventure? Darkest Dungeon 2 has a similar style thing. Isn't Darkest Dungeon 2 is a roguelike, right? I mean, I guess Darkest Dungeon 1's kind of a roguelike, but not really. Interesting. I'd heard. I haven't played Darkest Dungeon 2, but I've heard some sort of interesting things about it. Where optional GM mechanics? Is it in here? No. Damn it. Where is it? I know it's somewhere in here. Setting a roll difficulty. No. Advantage and disadvantage. No. Fear. No. Calling for action rolls. No. Damn it. Where is the devil deal? I don't know where it is. I know that there is a mechanic for it, because not only do I know it exists in general, but we saw it this session. So I wanted to be able to bring it up, and I should have found it beforehand. Like I said, I looked for it for a little bit. I should have looked for it harder. I was like, I'll just be able to pull it up on stream. I don't know why. I don't know why I just thought that it would be easier on stream for some reason. No. Damn it. Well, there is a devil deal of some kind. And I don't know where it is. Maybe deal, if I can just look up deal. Seraph, Ranger, Rogue, no. Oh my god. It's deals, no. Alright, I'm never gonna find it. Okay, but basically, we saw it with Matt this session, where at 146.59, he said, you can either roll for this, or you can just do it. You can just succeed, but you will all take a stress. And they ended up taking it. And I don't know what it's called in Daggerheart. It's also not called the Devil Deal in Blades in the Dark, which is where I was introduced to the concept. But that's my name for it, because I can never remember what the actual name is. And add a +1 to the Warlock counter, because I love a Devil Deal. And speaking of things that we haven't really seen in the rest of Age of Umbra, again, at least, unless I'm misremembering, I can't remember another time where Matt just offered that, succeed at a cost. Oh, that might be it. That sounds right. Succeed at cost. Nope. Nope. Now it's just giving... Oh, running an adventure? Where's this? Make every roll important. Because the GM can do with fear... Oh, I mean, speaking of the make a move whenever stuff, even in here, even in the GM guidance, a GM can choose to make a move in response to a failed roll or a result of fear, not whenever they want. Only ask the players to roll. Oh, it's probably not in here. It's probably somewhere else. That might be the VTM name. It's something like that. But yeah, it is succeeding at a cost. It's just offering them like automatic success in return for some sort of cost. And I said, it's not only super duper fun, I'll just tell you that right now, but also an immensely useful tool in a GM's kit to get players through a situation that they might be stuck in. If things are going poorly and it comes down to that really important roll, right? Like that box of doom type roll. Sometimes they'll just want to roll it. But offering them a devil deal and scaling the cost, you can always offer them whatever cost you want. You can make it ridiculous. They can always say no. But sometimes they'll say yes. They'll want that auto success, and they will take a devil deal in return. I remember in our Blades in the Dark game, at one point during it, there was a civilian in a fire. And I offered, and they were like going to try to like get the civilian out of the fire. And I offered them a deal that they didn't end up taking, but it's just stuck in my mind of, okay, I will either, we can talk about a role that you might use to do that. Or actually, I think they came up with it. They wanted to make an agility roll, I think. And I was like, okay, you can either just do that, like position and effect. I just said, do these sound good to you? And I was like, or I will give you an auto success on it, but you will be burned so badly that your character will be out of the next score while recovering. And you will need to make a new character for the next score. They did not end up taking that devil deal, but it's an example of like the type of really extreme devil deals that you can offer. It is total soft magic. You can offer whatever you want, and they can always say yes or no. And I also put another option. I think this is more, put this under maybe advanced advice, use at your own risk sort of stuff. It can also be a way if you realize mid-stream that you have constructed a scenario that in fiction feels like they should be like under the clock, or not under the clock, under like an amount of pressure against the clock, they should be rushing. But you don't have any really like good fictional representations for that in your head. Like if they do fail, you're not quite sure how you will like represent an increase in tension or pressure. Offering a devil deal to just ensure that they succeed on that check can be a way to never expose them to the lack of bad consequence that like you don't have in your head that you like just realized. Like I said, use at your own risk, because if they reject the devil deal, you can't force them to take it. If they reject it and then still fail, and then you still can't improv a way to increase the pressure, all of a sudden that devil deal is kind of revealed for the tactic that it was. But beyond these like tactics and tools, it's also just super fun. Like Matt definitely, just gave them the, the success, but they all take a stress. You can also make it much funnier, much wackier, especially on things that are low stakes. You can offer them like funny devil deals. I love doing that sort of thing. But again, it's this thing that we just haven't seen a whole lot of. So this maybe feels like the episode where, we're getting towards the end of the series and Matt is looking at all these mechanics or tools or options that he's never used or barely used. And maybe he's just kind of trying to like go through the portfolio a little bit and like include all of the mechanics that he just kind of naturally skipped over. I'm not sure if that's what's going on, but it would certainly be a cohesive explanation for this episode and how it felt. So I don't know, but I love a devil deal. Highly recommend it in any game, really. It always works because the cost is just whatever the GM comes up with, and the gift is just success. So anything that has a skill check or skill check equivalent can use a devil deal. Next small thing: specific questions, vague answers. At 4630, this is when they first see like the ghost of the people in the basement. They like walk into the house, and that's why they go into the house in the first place. And I just noted it as my kind of shit, my kind of DMing and playing. That I don't want to say I don't see by any means, but it was just the sort of thing that I love doing and I really focus on trying to do, and try to focus on encouraging my players to do, for the players to ask really specific investigatory questions rather than more broad questions. So like a more broad question for that scenario would have been like, do they seem like a ghost? Which the players kind of asked. Or do they seem like they're from the old world, right? Or the pre-apostasy. That's pretty vague. That's pretty abstract as a question. So I liked it a lot more when they got specific. Does their clothing look pre-apostasy or post? Which is something that I think is much more... as a GM, it makes a lot more sense to me that is what they would be able to perceive, right? That, okay, you have no idea if this guy is pre-apostasy, but you could tell some shit about their clothes. Clothes would look different, just at a glance. And I like the way that Matt responded to it. He kept it in the specifics by answering in kind of I said vague answers. It was actually a very specific answer that increased the vagueness or increased the ambiguity. by him saying the clothing you saw on them did not look tattered and dirty. That has no, I mean, if you take that sentence super literally, that has nothing to do with it being reminiscent of the apostasy riot or the olden times. It being dirty or clean. Like on its face, that has nothing to do with anything. But if you go one step deeper, it is, is clearly been implied. Obviously, shit's way worse now post-apostasy. So it's very intuitive, I think, to the players that like, oh yeah, our clothes now post-apostasy would be much dirtier and ragged and tattered. And that's what we've seen from like every NPC we've ever interacted with. So all of that makes total sense as an indication that this ghost is from the pre-apostasy. But it keeps it vague enough that the players can't be 100% confident in that. It leaves you just a bit of wiggle room, and they get to just make leaps in logic. They get to use their intuition rather than you as the GM just giving them an answer. And I think that is one of the things that really makes a player feel like they are solving a mystery, right? Or they're investigating something, is when even if the leap in logic is simple, they still have to make it, right? Matt in this answer is not saying yes or no. He is purely giving a standout detail based on, the question that she asked that might lead the party towards a conclusion. But they still have to make the conclusion. And I think that is a really small thing that is, if you remember it as a GM, I think it's one of those things that's hard to remember, but if you're really actively considering it and thinking about it, it's not that hard to make your answers more specific, but still convey information. It's mostly just like hard to like keep in the back of your head as you get used to it. Okay. That's pretty much it for my small things about that session. Now the big thing that stood out to me. White room explorations. I'm going to need to get a new term for it because 20250 really felt like D&D combat, but for exploration. Like, that environment that they were going through, to me, was all fluff and flavor, and that flavor did not seem connected to the mechanics in almost any way. I was like, Matt basically gave them nothing there. They're in some woods. They're lost. There's a clock that will tick as they fail, ending in a big consequence. They need to get out. To me, it truly felt equivalent to a barbarian swinging at the enemy with an axe for the 4th time in a row. And it really stood out to me. I was like, whoa. Because it is so rare to see that sort of thing in D&D because of the difference in like mechanical density for those things. And I said it here. I like that there are more mechanics to the point that you even can have a white room exploration. But I'm going to need to get a new term to explain it. And I wanted to explain my thoughts because it also had a little bit to do with location mechanics that I thought were kind of interesting. What's up, Perfect Fan? Thank you. Have a good one. Because the location was affected by Twisted Aetherweave. Which I was like, Wild Magic Zone, let's go. I love a locational effect. I love a zone. I love a passive change to the mechanics. I love that sort of thing. But it doesn't quell my white room accusations. If anything, it makes them a little bit more substantial. There's no reason given that there's Twisted Aetherweave here. And I said, let's not think too hard about the Kraken, but sort of like the Kraken, this is equivalent to throwing down a monster with a neat stat block and calling it a day. It's cool that you can do that, but that is kind of what's happening. And here I go into like granularity, and like granularity within the mechanics, density, you might say. I did think that this feature was a good example of the benefits of a more detailed check system. So comparing it to D&D's 1d20 system versus the 2d12 Fear and Hope system in Daggerheart, even if you use degrees of success in D&D, that is adding granularity to the result, to just like how you interpret the final number. That still requires interpretation on the GM's end, so it's way more difficult to actually tie any sort of features or mechanics or anything like that to it, as opposed to the 2d12 Fear and Hope in Daggerheart, where you can easily modify it. And I think Twisted Aetherweave, or not easily maybe, but you can modify it in a lot more ways. And Twisted Aetherweave was a good example, where it's a passive feature that actually pretty radically increased their likelihood of succeeding on the roll, right? Of passing the DC. It was essentially advantage, or half advantage, I guess, from D&D, but it also made them more likely to roll with fear. Uh-oh, bad thing. Which is cool. Like, you just can't get that sort of effect in D&D. It's kind of just impossible, because you only roll one die in D&D, and that boils down to one result. No matter how you interpret that result, it's one result. Whereas in Daggerheart, you have double the results to interpret. In fact, you actually have triple. You have your hope die value, your fear die value, and your total value. So you have triple the values to interpret and to build mechanics around in Daggerheart compared to D&D, no matter how you interpret those results afterward. And then, I compared it to something even more dense and even more granular, like Blades in the Dark's position and effect system, which has 6 total values that can then be interpreted with all of the combinations therein. So, that higher density allows you to make more mechanics that affect those things, which I think is cool. And I think it's one of the benefits. There are certainly detriments, don't get me wrong, but it is a good example, I think, of one of the benefits. Twisted Aetherweave sounds like an action movie character saying quantum to justify random stuff working. I get that. I mean, that's why I compared it to a Wild Magic Zone. Wild Magic Zone to me is that, like, justify anything sort of deal in D&D. And I love a Wild Magic Zone. We can have a Quantum Zone, that's fine. I love random and wacky locational zones. So I don't like random and wacky curses that like follow a player around, but I love random and wacky like zones or fields or areas where the players can like choose to interact with it or not. It's like, okay, if we go into the Twisted Aetherweave, it's gonna fuck with our magic. Do we need to prepare in any way before we do? Do we just want to go around? That sort of shit's sick to me. But it all gets into this White Room stuff. And I was thinking about like what makes a system more or less vulnerable to White Room encounters? And again, I need another term for them now because I'm expanding it beyond just combat. Because in D&D, I think combat is really the only facet of D&D that is vulnerable to this effect. And I have an idea as to why. But for now, I'll call them White Room encounters. Maybe chat, marinate on that a little bit. Let me know in the comments. And in terms of what makes something vulnerable to the white room effect, I think it has to do not necessarily with the density of rules, but specifically with what the rules take off of the GM's plate. How much do the rules reduce the need for GM interpretation? So I'm gonna write that down. That's the core concept. I think the more GM interpretation that is required at runtime, not during prep, but at runtime, the more vulnerable something is, a system is, to the white room effect. Call this the white room effect. And it is there more or less GM interpretation? And I'll give you an example of what I mean. Interpretation. I'll give you an example of what I mean using D&D. In D&D, I've talked about this at length. You can just throw down monsters and combat kind of runs itself. Actually thinking about what that means, right? Turn order runs itself. There is no need for the GM to make a decision about when a given turn is going to happen. In Daggerheart, you do. Even at the very basic level of when the spotlight gets passed to the GM, they have to choose which adversary to spotlight. That's not even chosen for them, right? Whereas in D&D, with an initiative system, the GM knows exactly when every adversary is going to go and when every PC is going to go. If the GM ignored initiative, it could run itself. Attack rolls run themselves, right? Because attack rolls are kind of analogous to skill checks, except for the fact that when a player rolls a skill check, the GM is setting that DC in the moment. Maybe they prepared it ahead of time. Maybe they didn't. But it's way less common, substantially less common, for a GM to determine AC at runtime, right? In the moment, right? AC is a predetermined thing. When you look at a stat block, it has AC. Maybe a GM modifies the AC before they actually run the monster. But then, again, the mechanics run themselves. There's no need for GM intervention. A robot could run the encounter with pre-programmed rules. It's just, the player made an attack. We algorithmically, we could say. I don't know exactly what to call this characteristic of rules or of a rules system. The closest I've been able to come up with is algorithmic. I can't say rules based, but if you imagine it as a computer program could run it and not need to make any random decisions, not need to just randomly pick a number. Because you could set up a program to be like, okay, choose a DC at random between 10 and 20, right? Combat doesn't need any of those sorts of decisions. There's no here's a range, pick within that range. There's asterisk, there's one, but I'll get to it later. Because AC, that's not a thing. At health, you can just take the average. That's on the stat block. Their attack rolls, how much damage they're doing. All of that is predetermined by the stat block. When a player makes an attack that requires a saving throw, the GM does not have to improv what the adversary's modifier is going to be. That's on the stat block. Everything is on the stat block. The only thing that's not on the stat block, really, that we could imagine being on there, is targeting priority. And we talk about this sometimes when we're watching D&D on Critical Eyes, is that concept of targeting priority. But you could imagine this in a more rules-based system. It could be that in the entire, system of D&D, that adversaries always attack the last person to attack them. That could be a rule. Would it be a good rule? I don't think so. But it could be. We could have a targeting priority ladder if you wanted, where they prioritize first people that have visibly healed during the combat. And then after that, people that have perceivably casted during the combat. And then the person that damaged them last, or the person that's closest, right? We could have a ladder, a gradient of targeting priority. If we don't even want it to be for the entire system, because, AC isn't consistent on every single monster, we could imagine this, on their stat block, could have a targeting priority ladder. And at that point, if that was the case, if a DMD monster's stat block came with a targeting priority ladder, you wouldn't even need a GM to run combat in D&D. You could run it as a board game. And that, I think, is the characteristic that determines how vulnerable or how likely a system is to run into the white room effect. And I think the reason that it stood out to me so crazy with this white room exploration is because in D&D, exploration has barely any mechanics. Certainly not an amount of mechanics that would allow exploration to be run by a robot. It is interpretive and it is improvisational, or not necessarily improvisational, but it is, we could say, DM fiat dependent, substantially more than combat. Same thing with social, maybe to a bit lesser of a degree, but similar thing with social. And a lot of people like that. This is not a critique of either way of doing it. I've gone back to this quote a lot. This quote is one of the things that made me start thinking about this aspect of rule systems. Is Brenly Mulligan talking about why he prefers D&D over a lot of other systems. And it's because he likes that combat could be handled by a robot. He doesn't want to think about combat that much. But he does want to think about social and maybe exploration. I don't know. I don't think he mentioned exploration in that clip. My darling. Gets ignored by everybody. But these mechanics that make it operable by a robot are inherently constraining. You have to simplify things down to where they can be handled in this programmatic sort of fashion. See you later, Tiny Monkey. And so that can be a huge detriment to someone who really wants to get deep on those mechanics. But it can also, that stuff can be really useful for someone who doesn't want to go deep on the mechanic, or who just doesn't want to think about it a lot during prep. People will frequently take stat blocks. And I mean, not even frequently. It's kind of seen as the baseline way to play D&D. Like, really think about that. D&D encourages you to make your own environments, make your own storylines, your own characters. Like, if you're not doing that, you're using a module, right? That's the typical way we think about it, is you're using like an adventure or a module that gives you locations and characters, exploration and social, as well as, maybe a plot, depending on the module. But it is just expected that, like, kind of by default, you are taking stat blocks from the Monster Manual. The Monster Manual is considered one of the core 3 books. It is considered so necessary, and so just like you will have it by default, that player abilities reference it. We just ran into that in the Kraken. Summoning spells will reference it. Wild Shape absolutely assumes that you have access to the stat blocks within the Monster Manual, and that you're not only using the PHB stat blocks. That would be ridiculous. And again, by default, they are assuming that you are taking those stat blocks and using them in your games. It's interesting, right? They're not assuming that you're creating your own stat block. That would be kind of weird if I pitched that as like the default way to play D&D. Like, imagine that. Imagine if someone came in and is like, well, what do you think about the Kraken stat block? And I'm like, oh, well, it wasn't how I would have created it. You know, if I was creating an ocean thing for this encounter like I would be, like if I just approached it from that perspective, that would be a little weird. Like that would feel a little bit off kilter or off base. How we talk about it instead is I talk about modifying the Kraken stat block or finding a different stat block and reskinning it. Most DMs, I would say, probably don't even really know how to make a stat block or like all the things that should be included without just looking at one. They would probably feel uncomfortable rating a custom stat block that they came up with a CR. Unless they're following the guidance that's buried in the back of the DMG. So this idea of D&D combat runs itself is not only like prevalent, and I definitely think exists, but it's almost endemic to the system. They assume that you are taking stat blocks and not making your own. That is not what they assume at all for locations and for environments, right? They don't give you default environments in a core like in the DMG, right? The equivalent would be if they had a big book of environments or locations like the Monster Manual. Like, you know, fucking Volo's Guide to the Realms or something. And it's just a big book of environments. Like, that sounds weird. But that would be the equivalent to the Monster Manual. So it's very strange. It's this idea of D&D combat runs itself. But I think that is what leads us. And I'm becoming more and more confident on, you know, what I used to call kind of a theory or a hypothesis of the White Room combat or the White Room effect. I'm becoming more and more confident on it every single day. And the fact that I felt this exploration as a White Room, I think only goes as evidence towards this overall kind of thesis that I'm developing. Because in Daggerheart, unlike in D&D, environments can have stat blocks. And so if you just grab an environmental stat block, plop it down in the middle of your world without any thought to how it, you know, coalesces, it'll function in a way that it kind of wouldn't in D&D, or it would at least feel way more strange. Way more strange. They would feel odd in D&D. But you can do it much more easily in Daggerheart. And so that really goes towards my whole idea that the White Room effect is kind of predicated on how much GM interpretation there is. And I've been just comparing D&D and Daggerheart. The next one that I obviously have, or actually the only one besides D&D really, that I have a substantial amount of experience in is Blades in the Dark. And Blades in the Dark barely has stat blocks. Like, period. Like, I truly can't even really think of what a Blades in the Dark stat block would even really look like. And the ones that I can think of, stat block. Let's see if it even makes sense. Like if anything even shows up. I don't even know if things will show up on Google when I search this. Not really. Yeah, that's awesome. Let's compare this to D&D monster stat. Or here, we'll do adversary stat blocks. Adversary stat blocks. And then we're going to do the same Google, but for D&D. And just see the top results. D&D 5e adversary stat blocks. So, the only thing I can really think of in Blades in the Dark that has a sort of stat block are the factions. There are a lot of default factions that are given that inhabit Duskwall. to give you a sense. Oh, there it is. Sorry, my headphone cable was constricting me. To give you a sense, I know exactly where they are because I did reference them quite often. This is a faction stat block. Let me make sure I'm holding it up to the camera appropriately. This is about how long they are. Now, I know that you can't really see that because of the lighting fixture, but I'll tell you the mechanics that are in here. You have the tier, which is important. That's a very mechanical thing. And 2 suggested faction clocks. Already, we're into the realm of suggestions. And then you have just a natural language description of their turf. For the Red Sashes, the HQ is in their sword fighting school/temple. Operates a handful of high-end drug dens across Crow's Foot and the docks. NPCs, Mylera Clev. Leader, shrewd, ruthless, educated, art collector. It's all like experience-esque descriptions, like soft descriptions, non-mechanical descriptions. Blades in the Dark absolutely expects you to care about anything that you present to your players and have to put in the work towards making it interesting. And something that I realized, I think, and I haven't asked my players, I didn't realize this soon enough to ask them. I think if I asked my players, I think they would say, and I would agree with, that on average, so smooth out the highs and the lows, on average, the Blades in the Dark campaign was more interesting. And there were more interesting individual pieces of that campaign than my D&D campaigns. Just more interesting on average. Not necessarily better or worse, but more interesting. And I think it is because I think it's part of this White Room effect. There's a huge benefit towards not making the GM the sole arbiter and interpreter of every facet of the game. Location, combat, social, everything you can imagine. Blades in the Dark makes it that way. Everything is interpretive. Everything. I can't think of a single part of Blades in the Dark that a computer could run. I'm being dead serious. I can't, like, in D&D, with D&D combat, if I was just there to tell the computer who an adversary should attack or go after, a computer could handle the rest of combat. If your players don't do anything, outside of the mechanics. They might sometimes, but broadly. A computer couldn't even come close to that for Blades. I legitimately cannot even think of a single thing that a computer could handle at all. So the closest that I've ever gotten to any sort of automation or computer handled anything is I put a bunch of the things that Blades in the Dark has for random tables. So they have like big random tables. So like this is the buildings. I think this one's the streets. And they all have like little, they have mood, impressions, use cases, types, details. So like, for example, a building, and I can roll on this chart. This is all on D6 charts. So for a building, I might describe the exterior as cut stone blocks with tiny bits of woodwork laced in between the large stone pieces. It's used as a bakery, but it has a tobacconist shop in the back. And the entire thing looks very, what do we see? Cozy and warm. Sure, you can feel the hearth light of the bakery spilling out through the open door in stark contrast to the rest of the cold street around you. That's all just off of, these random tables. And so the only bit of automation I did when I ran Blades is I put all of these things from the random tables into a dice roll macro on Roll20, And so then I could press a button and it would automatically roll and choose characteristics for me. And I could like set weights and probabilities for which ones were more likely to show up and which ones weren't. So I could easily generate a description of a landscape if I needed one off the top of my head. That's the closest that a computer could get to helping me. Not so. Not so in D&D for combat, and not so in Daggerheart for some things. There's still, don't get me wrong, there's a lot of GM interpretation in Daggerheart. And I think it strikes a balance that I personally like and enjoy. But I do think that the nature of it being more open to stat blocks, even for things like environments or non-combat adversaries, is going to open it up to this white room effect. I think it's really going to open it up to people just plopping shit down and trusting the system to handle it. And that's nice, but it also breeds a little bit of laziness. Like I said, I think my players would say that on the whole, Blades was a more interesting campaign because I actually had to sit down and think about everything that they were going to encounter. It's tougher, you know, but I think it is, it definitely led to it being more interesting. It would be great if there was more guidance for stat block creation because there are so many niche things I would want and just have to flavor over other things. Talking about D&D stat blocks. Yeah, certainly. Oh, but let's get back to the test that we were doing. Blades in the Dark adversary stat blocks versus, where is it? Where's the other? There we go. D&D adversary stat blocks. Simplifying and condensing 5e stat blocks, creature stat blocks, understanding monster stat blocks, monsters, how to stop a player from looking up monster stat blocks, know your enemy, a mini guide to monster stats, classes as enemies, adversary stat blocks, the player's toolkit V8.2, okay, actions and attributes, nothing to do with adversary stat blocks, player reference sheets, nope. Blades in the Dark Hound Playbook. The Hound is a class. Nope. And you can already see what's going on here, in a way. The Blades in the Dark, the only thing that's really statted out is the player stuff. Oh, I hadn't clicked enter. Never mind. Wait, enemy creation. Okay. Everything is the same here, really. List of all stat blocks. Okay, let's see. These are the two, but this is enemy creation. And this is awesome. Simplifying stat blocks, creature stat blocks, understanding stat blocks. Nothing in here about creating your own until probably this classes as enemies, I'm gonna guess. This is probably the only one that actually teaches you how to make a stat block. Whereas for Blades in the Dark, the top thing when you look up adversaries is a Reddit post 7 years ago, how to create them. Because you have to. You don't need hit points, armor class, or any of that sort of thing. In Blades, this is done without stats or numbers. You tweak the danger level by modifying the fiction. Page 11 suggests that if an opponent is especially difficult, you have to make a resistance roll before you can do your thing. If you're a GOT fan, Serial Pharrell versus almost anybody else. I mean, you can already see just how interpretive Blades is compared to D&D. So just fascinating. Fascinating to me personally. I want to get a game designer on to talk about this and to see if they think about this aspect of this, because it's kind of a quality of life feature in some ways. Having these mechanics that can even be statted out, can be constrained enough to stat out. How that functions as an assistance tool, like a help, a boon to a GM versus how it degrades the GM's ability or even possibly willingness to derive more interesting encounters from those things. Now, like I said, I'm excited for Daggerheart because I think the Daggerheart seems to strike a really good balance between those things in a way that I do not like with D&D. I'm going to say no to ads because I think we're approaching the end here. I think that D&D, at its core, one of my problems with it is that this GM interpretation aspect is so lopsided. I get it, and I get that some people might like that aspect of it, like the aforementioned Brenly Mulligan. I do not like that lopsided, kind of asymmetrical aspect to how much GM interpretation there needs to be in the various parts of the game. I think it in and of itself constrains the tone of like what a D&D game not necessarily can be about, but like on average will be about. The fact that so much GM interpretation is required for all these other aspects and so little is required for combat. At the very least, if a GM doesn't have anything, but they want to buff out the session time or they're just really swamped with work, they can always throw in a combat. And so many of the features are related to combat because there's more mechanical opportunity there. Harken back to what I was talking about with the Twisted Aetherweave up here. More mechanical density offers more opportunity to design features and mechanics. I think we see that very clearly with D&D. And when more features and mechanics are pointed towards one aspect of the game and not the others, that aspect is going to take more prominence. At least in my opinion. So yeah, it's a, what am I doing? This one. It is something that that really stuck out to me here. And I think as a GM, there's positives and negatives to everything that I'm saying. I think the White Room effect is purely the tendency for when more stuff is handled for you, when your creativity is less necessary towards the session functioning, you are less likely to put in that creative energy. It doesn't stop you from putting in that creative energy. We've seen all sorts of really cool combats in Critical Role, in D20. Interesting combats are very, very doable in D&D. But they do require that same level of creative energy that you would put in to a social encounter. It's just not necessary to put in that energy into combat for it to work in the first place. So I like Daggerheart's method of sort of cutting a line between these two things. I think there's a nice amount of mechanical density, but not too much. I think it is spread out across the pillars of play, at least to an extent. And overall, I think this will give us a lot of the benefits of both sides. It does have some of the downsides of both sides. Like Daggerheart doesn't just totally function without any GM interpretation. You still have to be awake at the wheel, for lack of a better word, unlike D&D. But I think it provides enough assistance and enough stats and mechanical density across the game to really help a GM take care of a lot of the like base load work and really focus on making things creative and making things interesting with their creativity. I think one of the things I'm really sort of personally observing about D&D versus Daggerheart is D&D might have so much mechanical density that we get into sort of a realm of now it's so constrained that people find it difficult to enact their creative ideas. I remember when we were watching The Kraken, someone came in, I think they were like a first-time chatter, and was talking about how chase sequences just don't really work in D&D. And I think that is, I won't say short-sighted, but I think there are ways to make it work, but I very much understand the mindset. I think the mindset is derived from this idea that a chase sequence normally at least has the potential to get violent, and violence is so constrained within the rules, there's so little GM interpretation, that it is hard to enact something that is related but doesn't have specific mechanics. Like a chase. Chases kind of have mechanics, but they're weird and they're wonky. And so I do think that is one of the things that we see. And I think if you go even deeper into the like rules heavy side of things, you start getting into like war games, start getting into like Warhammer 40K, you've sort of left the realm where the game pretends about being about anything else. You know what I'm saying? You're getting so close to the realm of like board games. We're like a board game. If I look on my board game shelf, where is it? Oh, it's right there. Right. If you play Scythe does not pretend that it's a game about building a mercantile empire and like trading between the other players and developing vast hordes of wealth in order to buy out competing companies, right? It doesn't pretend to be about that, because it's not. But D&D kind of does pretend to be about everything, right? You have so much of the mechanics dumped into combat, but it still pretends like it can be about social. And in a way, it's right. It can be. Depending on how creative you're willing to get with it. But as you get more and more rules dense, I think we start to get more and more towards this board game style of things. Like I said, Warhammer 40K. Warhammer 40K is like an army tactics RPG. That is like what it is about. You're not doing other shit, really. And so I think D&D is this really interesting sort of middle case where it's not so rules heavy that it has totally abandoned all of the extraneous rules, but it's not rules light and or not cohesive enough in its rules that it can really pretend to have equal focus in all aspects of the game. So it's interesting. It's interesting that it's the one that really struck it gold. What you're describing with a book of environments is what they should do if they want to convince me there isn't a default setting. Fucking preach. Yeah. Yeah, they should. Either give me a default setting, give me Duskwall so that you can give me a bunch of factions, which is exactly what Blades in the Dark does. So you can give me a bunch of factions. You can actually make random tables that make sense because you, the creators of the game, know what Duskwall is like. You can give me a map of the Shattered Isles because you know that is like what you're writing the book about. That is the context in which the book exists. If you want to change it, go for it. But that is how the book is written. Either give me all of that. Tell me about Silkshore and the level of occult influence and criminal influence and wealth and security. Tell me about Dunslough and the Dunslough Ghetto or the Mire or the Dunville labor camp. Like, tell me about all of these things, or give me a big book of random environments that I can slot into any of your various settings that have existed across the years. Like, I understand why the creators of D&D would want to say that it's set in the multiverse. They've had so many settings across the years. And they want people to use all of those settings cynically so that they can sell books. But if you actually want to convince me that the multiverse is the true default setting of D&D, don't just give me nothing. Because that's basically what D&D does. I mean, they give you... Let me see. Chapter 1, A World of Your Own. Teaching you how to make your own homebrew world. You know what? Hey, if this truly is the multiverse, that makes a lot of sense. Creating a multiverse makes total sense. But then I get nothing else. It's all how to create your own. It's all how to create your own. There's no help given. Again, going back to this GM interpretation that is required to run a D&D environment, location, setting. Unless, and this is again where it gets a little cynical, you buy one of their books. So either you got to put in all the work, and we'll tell you, we'll give you some advice on how to put in the work, and hey, I got nothing against that. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. But it's either you have to put in all of the creativity work, or you got to buy one of our books. Extra books. I don't know. And making the process for creating your own, for that creativity and that advice, something that takes up hundreds of pages is, revelatory that it's basically just writing advice at the end of the day. It's not really D&D advice. It's like, hey, here's how you world build on a story level. This advice is not going to be too dissimilar to something that George R.R. Martin would tell you. Well, I guess quality notwithstanding. So yeah, ridiculous. I mean, it's ridiculous given what they pitch it to be, I think. And I'm getting more radicalized on that idea. I think that any new system that I learn, I am going to be looking for, do they have a dusk wall? Or do they have a way, an easy way, for me and others to make our own, a la Daggerheart? At least for systems that I'm going to GM. I'll play anything. My standards are low in terms of what I'll play. But for anything that I'm going to GM, those are starting to become requirements for me. Anyways, so that is episode 7. A strange episode, I would say. Yeah. It's making me look at the whole series through a slightly different lens than I have been. And is making me uncertain, I suppose, of how it will even end. And how satisfying that ending will be, or how satisfying it even could be. But it's definitely made me interested in running Daggerheart. That I will give it every single day of the week. And it makes me excited to see what they'll do next. Because, this game, Age of Umbra, I should say, has, just progressively, especially since they left Desperlock, has come off as more and more and more of just like kind of a beer and chips fuck around home game, and I got no problem with those. But those are sort of predicated on the idea of enjoying the fucking around. And I'm not into Age of Umbra as a setting, like as a tone. I'm not a horror boy. I have avoided Dark Souls, not because I'm like scared of it, but just because it's like just depressing to me. Like I just don't enjoy it. And that sort of tone is obviously very pervasive throughout Age of Umbra. It's the point. But it makes it hard for me to enjoy a fuck around game in that sort of setting when I can't really be interested in the lore. I can't really be interested in the overall plot or storyline because there kind of isn't one, or there, what is there is just an excuse for the fucking around. When that is the case, and it's in a situation that I'm not particularly interested in, makes it hard to want to watch it. But I like all of the other Daggerheart frames. So I am very hopeful that we get something else in Daggerheart, whether it's a limited series, whether it's the next, campaign, whatever. And it's in either a separate frame, or it's in, a whole custom world that is more akin to Exandria than Umbra. If they start a new campaign and it's set in Age of Umbra, I can't lie, I don't know if I would want to cover it. Maybe if they had a whole campaign's worth of time, it would be more akin to something that I would like, despite the setting. But even then, I don't know. I highly doubt they do that. I hope. I also doubt it, to be clear. I also doubt it. But I really hope not. Because, I'm just slowly losing it. But last episode's tomorrow. We'll see how they wrap it up. I mean, I've said it before. I think Matt has great dramatic timing. Despite my issues with the end of some of the arcs, I think the Kavarn battle was kind of cool. I think the Briarwood battle at the Ziggurat was cool. I thought Thordak sucked, but Raishan Part 1 was dope. So, I've pretty much always enjoyed the end of Matt's arcs. Maybe Feywild as a miniature arc notwithstanding, because I did not like the Sondor fight or encounter in general. But that's honestly the exception. Most of Matt's arcs in Vox Machina, I really enjoy how he ends them. So I'm crossing my fingers. I'm hopeful for the Barrow of Blind Repose, and we'll just have to see what happens. And then who knows when I will go live for the last discussion. Because I'll want to kind of do a bit of a retrospective, but honestly, this has already kind of turned into a bit of a retrospective. So I'll probably just go live for the episode 8 discussion on Wednesday. Keep the schedule consistent. No reason to mess with what ain't broke. But if something especially wild happens, I might take a little bit of extra time, so I won't guarantee the Wednesday next week. We'll see. I don't think they would do that. I could see a campaign world where Umbra is some island, but the whole world, nah. Look, I'm not saying I hope. My expectations of what I would have expected out of this series have been pretty thoroughly diverted? No, subverted, I suppose. This is very different from what I expected. So I'm not relying too much on my expectations of what will come next. But what you guys are saying seems very reasonable to me, and I certainly hope that's the case. I don't think the man game pan will be horish. But all that said, I will leave it there. Yeah, we will have the last discussion probably on Wednesday, maybe not. And then we're going to do probably a week or two of like just Critical Role and maybe the occasional one-off stream. I'm not starting another series immediately after Age of Umbra. Not only because I want to see what Critical Role announces next, but I also want to take a break for at least a second between like scheduled series and do a little bit more one-off stuff and finish up the code. It's nearing the finish line. So I will see you guys on Friday for Critical Eyes. Also, I guess the last thing, Critical Eyes schedule not changing for the time being. I'll talk about that more on Friday. But for the time being, I kind of like Monday, Friday, Monday. I have some thoughts on possible changes, but I'm not. It'll stay Friday and Monday for now. So, with that, I will see you then. Have a good rest of your week, and goodbye.